Welcome to the International Express to Book Central, departing now. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. Hi there! Thank you for joining me today on the train to Book Central. I'm your host, Jules. Each week, while we travel along on this train, we will discuss a book or a short story or maybe a poem, and most definitely some medieval literature. I'll tell you something of the plot and then discuss some of my favorite aspects of whatever it is we just read. These episodes will of course contain heavy spoilers, as well as shock horror gasp, context and subtext, so be warned. Hi all, I hope you had a good July. I thought it would be fun to do a little roundup of what we read this month, aside from what was featured on the podcast. These are going to be almost like mini reviews, and I'd love to hear what you've been reading this month. Just for the sake of disclosure, I did receive advanced reading copies of some of these books in exchange for honest reviews, with the emphasis on honest. Let's get into them. The first book I read this month was Motherthing by Ainslie Hogarth, which came out in September of 2022 and was published by Knopf Doubleday. Here is a short description. Motherthing is about Ralph and Abby Lamb, a young married couple in love who move back in with Rolf's mother, Laura, due to her failing health. Abby hopes she and Laura can finally build a good relationship, as Abby is desperate for a real mother figure after her own traumatic childhood. But, sadly, it is not to be, as Laura takes her own life. Ralph, consequently, sinks into a deep depression, which is worsened when it seems that perhaps Laura has come back to haunt him and Abby from the afterlife. Unwilling to accept this, Abby needs to find a way to rescue Ralph and banish Laura. She will show them that she is a good woman and worthy of love, even if she is a little messy. But add to this that at her work as a nurse, Abby's favorite resident is about to be taken away, and she is pushed to the breaking point. The only question that remains is, how far is she willing to go? Motherthing was a fascinating read, which straddled the genres of horror and the supernatural as well as domestic suspense. It isn't told chronologically, and Hogarth also plays with different forms of writing. While some of it is told in straightforward third-person prose, some of the scenes are staged almost like a play, which kind of underlines the performativity of relationships in everyday life. The story begins with Laura's suicide and then moves back and forth, revealing both how Abby and Ralph met, as well as the aftermath of Laura's death. As Ralph descends into depression and grief, Abby feels more and more pressure to make things right, to cling on to her husband's love and to erase all the neglect from her past. Add to that the pressure of potentially losing her favorite patient, and Abby finds herself at a crossroads. The only real question is, how extreme will her response be? The title comes from a short passage in the novel where Abby describes a baby monkey who, separated from their mother, will cling onto everything, even a rolled-up pair of socks, and accept it as its mother thing, an inadequate replacement which nonetheless brings comfort. Abby's own childhood was a rough one, and Motherthing is by no means an easy read. It deals with depression, suicidal ideation, abuse, both sexual and emotional, and more. It's no light and breezy thriller, and even for a horror novel, it did affect me quite a bit. This book is a tough examination of motherhood and selfhood, of how we are inextricably intertwined with our parents, and it questions whether we can ever entirely untangle ourselves from our childhoods. While the answer isn't necessarily encouraging, I'd nonetheless recommend Motherthing to those who know that they're comfortable with some gore and horror and that they can handle it. Otherwise, maybe give this one a pass. After Motherthing, I kinda stuck with the motherhood and horror theme for another one of my reads this month, which was The New Mother by Julia Crouch. This thriller came out in October 2021 and was published by Bookouture. In The New Mother, we meet Rachel, an Instagram influencer who is setting out on a new adventure, motherhood. She's gonna need some help though, so she hires one of her fans, Abby, as a helper. Not only will Abby help with the baby, she will also get a full makeover and feature on Rachel's Instagram. Abby is over the moon to be working with her idol, but things quickly turn out differently than both of the women had hoped. Instagram isn't reality, and Rachel isn't who Abby expected. But Abby isn't quite who Rachel expected either, and as the two women begin circling around each other, and as Rachel's due date comes ever closer, ugly truths are revealed about both, and you can't help but wonder who is in danger and who is the danger. I've been enjoying thrillers which center around social media influencers lately. While usually, in a thriller, I'm trying to figure out who is lying and who might be different than they're pretending to be, this gets flipped on its head in these kind of thrillers. We all know that the lives we pretend to have on Instagram aren't reality, so with these influencer protagonists, I'm actually looking for what is real rather than what is fake. I enjoy this flip because I read a lot of thrillers, and sometimes they can become a little repetitive. So in this way, it stays fresh and exciting. While I liked reading The New Mother, I do have to admit I didn't entirely get into it. I liked that Crouch switched between the perspectives of Rachel and Abby so that we got different takes on the same situation, but I didn't really connect with either of them. And the one character I did connect with didn't feature as much as I would have liked. There were also some radical kind of mood switches, which I didn't feel were set up entirely well. And Abby also handles certain sensitive themes in a really abrasive way, which kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I'm fully aware that just because something is featured in a novel doesn't mean the author supports it or is advocating for it, so I'm absolutely not flagging this as an issue with Crouch. Rather, it was maybe a bit of an issue with how I wanted to see these themes portrayed. Maybe I just needed a little bit of extra context, which the novel didn't give me. It's a fun ride though, and it made for a good Saturday afternoon. Speaking of slightly abrasive characters, My Nemesis by Charmaine Craig featured a deeply unlikable character who I was nonetheless fascinated by. This novel was published in February of this year by Grove Atlantic. My Nemesis starts with Tessa, a successful American writer, calling Wa, the Asian wife of a philosopher Tessa has developed a friendship with, a quote, insult to womankind, unquote. Wa is too submissive, according to Tessa. From this confrontation, the novel jumps back and forth in time, explaining at once how we got here and also what happened after the confrontation. I think I'm going to leave it there with the description, because it's hard to summarize My Nemesis. White feminism, i.e. the kind of feminism that doesn't take into account the impact of race and class on the female experience, is some of the worst kind of feminism, and Tessa embodies it to the T. She's so self-centered that she leaves destruction in her wake, whether it's Wa, Tessa's own daughter, or her husband, and she doesn't even really care. The way Tessa's individualistic approach to life contrasts with Wa's personality was really interesting to read, and I couldn't put the book down. I was utterly fascinated by the train wreck of it all. It's hard to really describe My Nemesis, because it takes the form of Tessa's mea culpa, an apology, after having called Wa an insult to womankind. We're entirely in Tessa's head throughout the book, and so we never really get to know Wa, except through Tessa's eyes. I think it's very important that the misogynistic stereotype of the submissive Asian woman gets addressed, as it's such a damaging stereotype, and My Nemesis does this really well, especially in the first half or so of the book. After that, I do kind of think the book loses some of its focus as other characters get drawn in and other side plots become more relevant. Overall, though, this was a whirlwind of a reading experience, and the novel did make me kind of reinvestigate some of my own biases and feminist attitudes, so I would wholeheartedly recommend it. A book I was really looking forward to this month was The Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekera, which came out on the 11th of July and is published by Tordotcom. The Saint of Bright Doors is about Fetter, who was raised as a mercenary by his mother. His mission? To kill his father, a saint. Feta turned his back on this mission though, and he has tried to build a new life for himself in Luriat, away from his mother, away from saints, and away from anti-gods. But destiny has a way of finding you, whether it's through the mysterious bright duels, or through an email announcing the visit of a god. As Vetter is forced to discover what he's really made of, so we get to explore a fascinating world of both curses and saints, and mobile phones and bureaucracy. I was literally chomping at the bit to get into this book, and I fell into it straight away. I'm a massive fantasy and sci-fi fan, and I've been actively trying to expand my reading beyond the common European medieval/Tolkien-inspired books. In The Saint of Bright Duels, I found myself dropped into a very unfamiliar surrounding, inspired by, I think, South Asian mythology and history. The Saint of Bright Duels strikes a fine balance between being epic and legendary, with its chosen one, a murder quest and gods, and an urban fantasy, as Vetter has access to email and the internet. I loved how this came together, and how Chandrasekera just expects you to go along with it. There's no massive exposition at the beginning. Instead, you have to discover this world along with Vetter and trust that everything that's relevant will somehow be explained. As a novel, The Saint of Bright Duels plays with a whole lot of different fantasy tropes and twists them on their heads. It is also a novel about so many different relevant social themes. It's about destiny and fate, about how our parents shape us, about violence, about revolution, immigration, bureaucracy, racism and race theory, and so much more. And I haven't even mentioned the Bright Duels themselves yet. I found it really hard to summarize this novel for anyone I've spoken to about it, because it is at once very complex and yet also quite a simple story which I wouldn't want to spoil. I don't think The Saint of Bright Duels is necessarily very accessible for novice fantasy readers, kind of in the way that Dune is not a good entry point into science fiction. You have to work for it, but I found Chandrasekera's book to be a very rewarding read, which really expanded what fantasy can do for me. Next, in this month, I finally gave in and read a heavily hyped book, namely The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I usually try to avoid books that are super hot, not because I'm trying to be edgy and cool, but because I find it really hard to make up my own mind about them when I'm getting opinions from all sides, especially when they're super positive opinions. But then someone lent me their copy, and I decided to finally sit down and read it. I don't know if it's really necessary to offer a blurb for such a famous novel or well-known hype novel, but here we go. Monique, an up-and-coming journalist, is given the scoop of a lifetime when reclusive film star Evelyn Hugo offers her an interview. Except that Evelyn wants a lot more than just an interview. She wants Monique to write her life story, of how she met her 7 husbands, what she had to do to get to the top, and who the true love of her life was. What Monique doesn't know is that there is much more at stake than just a best-selling memoir. The 7 Husbands covers so many interesting themes, which were really interesting to me. The way Evelyn thinks about her own body, both as a tool for advancement but also a tool for enjoyment, is fascinating. The way Evelyn thinks of her own Cuban heritage, at once repressed and also something necessary, is fascinating. The perpetual struggle of being at once a desirable woman but not a woman that desires is fascinating. All these things come to the fore really strongly in The 7 Husbands, but it never went quite as deep as I wanted it to. I think what my downfall here is that the hype did affect me, even though I tried not to let it. I had expected from everything that I'd read and heard that it would be a very intense, thought-provoking and complex novel, and I feel like I only got that in part. The novel is a lot more breezy than I expected, and so I found myself merely whelmed by it. I had fun reading it, I raced through it in an evening, and then was left with a sense of slight disappointment. That doesn't mean The 7 Husbands isn't a great book and that it isn't important, that it addresses all the themes it does. I think it's a valuable book and I'm glad for the representation that it provides. I just wish I could have gone into it without the high expectations the hype created, because then I think I could have appreciated more for what it is than for what I would have expected it to be. It is in many ways a flawless novel though. Taylor Jenkins Reid writes in a really engaging way that sucks you in immediately. Her writing is direct, it's fresh, and it's very empathetic. Her descriptions of the glamour of Hollywood are also really evocative and immediately transported me to LA. I did feel a little distanced from it due to the wealth on display. I think I've just entered my let's eat the rich phase, so I couldn't really connect to the ease the wealth brought. While money doesn't remove all obstacles, it does make many things a lot easier. I also wish we'd gotten a little more time with Monique, who I found much more interesting. I do also have to admit that the way Monique's story eventually tied in with Evelyn's didn't entirely work for me. So overall, I was merely whelmed by this novel, which just once again teaches me that I either need to be ahead of the hype or let more years pass. Maybe I'll have a different opinion on this book at a later date, and I absolutely understand how it can mean a lot to other readers. Just didn't entirely click for me, unfortunately. And finally, I read Fire Sermon by Jamie Quatro. I finally read it, after promising to do so since its release in February 2018. It was published by Picador, and I've struggled finding the best way to blurb this for you. Fire Sermon is the story of Maggie and her passionate affair with the poet James. Throughout the novel, Maggie struggles to unite this raw emotion with the life she has led so far as a devout and loyal mother and wife. How can this passion be united with her faith? What kind of woman is she? What kind of life is she trying to lead? I'll admit that's not the best description, but in my defense, Fire Sermon is very hard to summarize. It does tell the story of Maggie and how she is torn between the life she's built and the burning passion she develops with James. But it is much more of an interrogation of Maggie as a person, of how she has created a facade of a loving and devout mother and wife while simmering with resentment, and yet of how she actually does love her children and her husband, but still wants to escape them, of how her faith at once guides her and is something she feels restrained by, maybe. For me, faith is something which requires interrogation, especially as you grow up and mature. I am always testing my own faith, asking questions of it, and sometimes being disappointed by it. I think it's the same for Maggie, and I found the theological discussions she and James have very interesting. That might not be true for every other reader, though, especially if you're not spiritual in any way. What I found most interesting about Fire Sermon is how alive it is with emotion. Maggie is literally almost burning with raw emotion, and she doesn't know where to put it. In my review for the novel, I wrote that it reminded me of the sculpture The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa in Rome, and of how in the statue, Teresa's facial expression, as she is about to be pierced by an arrow, is somewhere between suffering and glory. It is that edge which Quatro finds in her writing as well, and it makes for a very propulsive reading experience. It is not the most straightforward of reads, as Quatro hops around in time quite a bit and also uses different forms of writing, from third-person prose to poems to emails to something I'd call almost a descriptive flow of consciousness. While this might take some getting used to for some readers, and while some parts of the novel are also sexually explicit, I still think it's a very rewarding reading experience, which fits in very well, I think, with all the other books I've read. And that's some of what I read this month. I do try to hop around in different genres, but sometimes a theme does just emerge. I think this month I read a lot to do with mothers and the relationship we have with parents and loved ones. Do let me know what you're reading at the moment. I'm always looking for recommendations. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.